You can proceed.
All good. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, to the Planning Advisory Committee meeting of Thursday, May 5th, 2022. It is 5 o'clock, so we're calling the meeting to order. If we could, we have a quorum tonight, but there is just a couple of people, so you will hear Jim and Leanne a lot in this meeting. But with that, if I could have the approval of the agenda, that the agenda of the Planning Advisory Committee meeting of May 5th, 2022 be approved as presented. Thank you. Moved by Jim, seconded by Leanne. And approval of minutes that the planning, all in favor, sorry. Thank you. Going down the agenda is the approval of minutes that the Planning Advisory Committee minutes dated March 24th, 2022 be accepted as presented. If somebody, Leanne or Jim, could move that. Thank you, Leanne. Second by Jim. Perfect. All in favor? Thank you. And we have two agenda items this evening. The first one is a CIP application regarding the following recommendation: that the Planning Advisory Committee approve a request for additional CIP funding under the interior commercial category for 119 King Street West, also known as Water Girl Quilt Company, to the maximum amount of $836.54. If I could have Jim or Leanne move that so we could discuss it. Thank you, Jim. Second by Leanne. And Dana, with that, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a highlight of your report.
Thank you, Chair Jansman, through you to the committee. So members will probably recall, I brought this up under a verbal report at the last Planning Advisory Committee meeting. And I would like to take this opportunity to apologize. There was a significant oversight on my part. I misinterpreted a conversation and direction that I received from our CAO regarding the best approach and how to bring this forward to the committee. And I handled it. There was a very awkward moment during our last PAC committee meeting, which is, of course, and I do appreciate members bringing their concern forward, because that was not the appropriate way to bring that request forward for approval. So I would also like to apologize to Matthew personally for implicating you whatsoever in that process, as well as for Lindsay, because you were chairing the meeting on your own that night, not chairing, but administering the meeting on your own. And I'm sure I created some awkwardness for you too. So I would like to just, take this opportunity to address that. And that is the reason that you are now seeing this written report come forward under this meeting. So you'll be familiar with this request because I did bring it up verbally, but we've essentially run into a situation with Water Girl Quilt Co., who is previously approved for funding for the signage program. And subsequent to the approval, they discovered there was a need for some electrical work to accommodate to power some sewing machines that they need to use for the classes that they're running out of this new location. So they had to expense just over $1,500 in additional electrical work, and they've requested consideration of the committee in providing matching grant funding under the interior category of the CIP program. And I'm recommending approval of that amount tonight, looking hopefully for the committee's approval of this request. So the work has been completed. It's not recent work, it's not pending work, it was completed, and the request is to provide some funding for that already completed work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana, for all of it. Thank you. With that, if Jim or Leanne have any questions for Dana, Leanne, if you'd like to go first, that would be great.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dana, thank you for this report. But you know what, we can only learn from our mistakes, and moving forward, this is excellent. And I'm sure that this was a learning experience for everybody, right? So we talked about this earlier, and we did verbally accept it. And I'm going to support this tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Burton. Jim?
I think I'm unmuted, Chair. Thank you. No, I have no further questions. I intend to support this application, and I certainly appreciate Dana's comments.
Perfect. Thank you. With that all being said, then, if we could vote, all in favor? Perfect. Carried. Thank you. Moving to the 5.2. The recommendation that the Planning Advisory Committee recommend to Council the proposed Community Improvement Plan Program amendments as outlined in PAC Report 06-2022 in accordance with Section 28 of the Planning Act as amended. If I could have a mover, please. Thank you, Leanne. Second by Jim. Perfect. And before I give you the microphone, so to speak, Dana, I just want to thank everyone who might have submitted comments or considerations or suggestions to Dana. But if that hasn't yet been the case, that's very, very okay, because this is the time. This is the discussion, and sometimes it's easier to propose something after you see the first draft or something. So with that being said, Dana, if you wouldn't mind going through your slideshow and your report in general.
Thank you, Chair Jansman, through you to the committee. So I won't spend a lot of time on the actual report portion, and I'll just take you right through to these slides. So we've completed a pretty comprehensive review, and as Councillor Jansman mentioned, we've received some great feedback from members of the committee, as well as past applicants, recipients of the funding program. That's something that we are actively always seeking feedback from those recipients. So I think we've got a really good handle on some of the oversights or gaps or potential opportunities for enhancements of the program. So I'll take you through section by section. We're going to cover the downtown Riverwalk section first. And we've got this, I'd say, would have the most extensive list of proposed amendments. It's certainly the category that gets utilized the most through the program. So we spent significant amount of time on this category especially. So I'll just take you through one by one. The first recommendation is that we increase the matching signage grant from 1,000 up to 5,000. So as it sits today, it's $1,000 matching funding. And we've noticed that it's, when you look at the actual expense for new signage, especially when you're getting into the lighting aspect, we're not, I would say on average, it's costing our applicants anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 to install new signage. So we're finding that the $1,000 grant just really isn't sufficient. And I would say that category, that portion of the downtown funding has been the most utilized to date. That's what we really receive the most, is requests for support in signage grants. So I think this would be a really good one to top up, and the $5,000, of course, would be matching as well. And the next one would be the facade grant. We're receiving quite a bit of uptake on this aspect too, and we're recommending an increase of $5,000 to $10,000 under this category. Something I do want to know is the lighting does fall under the facade grant category as it sits to date. So that's another thing that we found. Once you were finding a lot are forced to make that choice, where if they're going to be utilizing that $5,000 in facade funding for lighting, it really doesn't leave that much for even a paint treatment to the outside, let alone a full facade restoration. So we're thinking that a $10,000 amount would be more reasonable, and I think we would get better bang for our buck, so to speak. We would actually start to see some property owners and businesses complete more extensive facade improvements if that grant support was there. And another increase that we're recommending under the interior commercial aspect is increasing that from $3,000 to $5,000. We're just finding again that it really isn't quite sufficient when you look at the extent of the investment that a lot of either businesses or property owners are having to make when it comes to leasehold improvements to get those commercial spaces ready. And another area that we're recommending a change to is increasing the permit fee grant. It currently sits at $500 and that's capped at $500. So we're recommending increasing it to a minimum of $1,000 or a maximum of 10% of the permit cost, because there are quite a few projects that will get upwards of $1,000 or $2,000 building permit cost. All of our sign grants also have a sign permit requirement, so there is a permit cost to that as well. So we thought that would be a good area to also top up as well. Another area is reallocating the accessibility grant of $5,000 to the facade category. To be perfectly honest, we really aren't seeing a whole lot of uptake on the accessibility grant. I would say primarily because for that, it's the ability to put in a permanent ramp really doesn't exist for a lot of the downtown properties. I think I'd spoken about this recently, when you look at the visitor center museum, the ramp that was installed there, when you factor in the grade and the amount of distance that you have to cover to ensure that that ramp is accessible, it's going to eat up a large portion of the sidewalk space. So we really haven't seen a lot of use of this grant. So we thought it would be better allocated into the facade category, and then it can be used to support those broader facade improvements. So overall, we're not really you're not seeing an increase. It's more of a shifting the accessibility grant into the facade grant and really enhancing the flexibility of what can be done under that funding. And then we're also recommending an increase to the loan category from $20,000 up to a maximum of $100,000, not to exceed 25% of the total project value. So again, we're thinking that this would really help incentivize some of those property owners that might be interested in making the full restorations, whether it be facade restorations or interior second and third story restorations, to really bring those properties back to full use and hopefully get some of those upper stories occupied as well with some new residences. And then we're also recommending that we adopt a new sign and lighting design guidelines with a checklist. So we'd be bringing that forward as part of the final CIP plan. I haven't provided a copy of that for your review tonight because it will be a fairly extensive list. And we recommend doing the same thing for the facade design guidelines. We have design guidelines now, but they aren't overly prescriptive. They're more recommendation based. They're very text heavy. So it's more like a report on potential areas that we could look at, but we want to provide something a lot more focused. That's, a bulleted list of these are the facade guidelines that must be adhered to. And here's the checklist that staff are going to implement as part of our review. And next, we're also proposing that we allow for multiple facade applications to be submitted for properties in cases where they're situated on corner lots in high traffic areas. So we've got some properties that are, for example, O'Haffey's, TD Bank would be examples of those type of properties. The Springer property would be another one where a lot of times you will have double facades and sometimes businesses on both street fronts as well. So we really just wanted to provide more options for facade improvements to those properties that at the end of the day would really equate to two businesses. So we also recommend issuing loan funds as installment versus lump sum payments, really just trying to get a better handle on the actual loan funds and the amount that we're dispersing, and have more, checks and balances tied to the actual loan funds and what they're being expensed on. So we would also have it tied to pre-established project phases that would be aligned with the building inspection. So we would work together with the building department on ensuring that those installment payments are being issued in accordance with periods that make sense as construction is actually progressing on the project. And then we'd also propose extending the project completion deadline from 12 to 24 months. For the most part, applicants have had no problem completing within the 12 months, but for those more extensive projects where they are looking at, multi-story restorations, it can take quite a bit of time to really complete those. So we'd like to allow for a little bit more time in that area. And then we're also recommending permitting multiple funding applications per property under the following conditions. So this would be really to support separate owner and tenant initiated property improvements. So a lot of times you'll have a property owner that wants to make their own improvements, and then a commercial tenant that will come in and have leasehold improvements to make, and they are very distinct from each other. So we thought there would be merit in allowing applications to come from both the property owner and the commercial tenant. And we'd also, the next condition that would allow multiple applications would be supporting subsequent renovations that are completed no less than 36 months after a previously funded renovation, barring that they are completely distinct. So it's not to fund the same renovation twice. It would be to build on what had been funded through that previous application. And then the third condition for that would be within no less than 5 years following the receipt of previous CIP funding. And this is really to allow for those properties that, after a certain amount of time with any renovation or enhancement, things, do deteriorate and they require upgrade or improvement. So we just thought it would be a good opportunity to allow for that, because as it sits today, it's a one-time only thing. Once a property receives funding, technically they can never receive funding again under the current terms of the program. So we felt that was very restrictive. And on to another proposed amendment is expanding the eligible area to include Edward Street up to Wood Street. So that is the street immediately south of the railway tracks. And then we'd also propose extending King Street west to Sophia Street, and it already ends at East Street. So there's no change there. But there's 2 blocks where we have a smattering of commercial properties on King Street that simply aren't eligible because they're not within that approved CIP area. So we thought there would be merit in looking at expanding that an additional 2 blocks to the west, and really thinking long-term, the hope, or not hope, but I think what we're seeing in a lot of other communities, and we've already seen a little bit here and there, is some residential properties are eventually getting converted to where the first stories are being used for commercial purposes. So we thought that would provide that opportunity. Once at 426 is a prime example of that transition that's happened, where that used to be a full residential, and it's gradually been converted to allow for commercial on the first story and still have residential above. So I think we may see some eventual expansion in that area, and that extension would support that. And then we're also recommending incorporating a grant repayment requirement. That has never existed before. The loan has to be repaid, if it has to be paid, of course, if the property should sell before the loan is repaid to the town. But for the grant, there really is no requirement for it to be repaid. And we felt that there would be a valid argument for putting that in place under the following 2 conditions. One being if the project isn't completed within 24 months of approval. So that's to address those projects that are dragging on and just don't seem to be coming to fruition as they were originally proposed to the committee, and as per the terms of their agreement. And then on the second condition under that would be if the property sells and changes use within 24 months of approval. So that's, for example, if a property was converted from commercial to full residential, then at that point we would request the return of those grant funds, because it's no longer a commercial property and really doesn't fit with the intent of the program. So those are the amendments under the downtown area. Chair Jansman, I'm not sure how you want to approach this. Do I take you through the whole section, or do we want to pause after each section for questions, comments?
Actually, Dana, great minds think alike, or the other side to that, eh? But anyway, yeah, I'm thinking this might be just a nice place to pause for a minute, just to, because I know I've been writing notes and whatnot, just for comments or clarification questions or that kind of thing. So with that, Leanne or Jim, do you have anything you want to inquire about at this point? Jim, if you would.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Dana. Good presentation. I've got a couple of comments and a couple of questions. I think the increased signage and facade grant is good. I think that will add some quality to the product. I think it needs to be done hand in hand with the guidelines, though. And I was glad you mentioned that, because I think we need to, perhaps we'll get more of that. We talked a little bit about it at our last meeting. We'll get more the end product that I think will really help the town. So that needs to be hand in hand, the increased fee and more reliant or more adherence to the guidelines on both those. I do have one question on the increased loan category from 20,000 to 100,000. Are we having any issues, or is staff having any issues rather with repayment of the loan category as it currently stands at 20,000? Because that's a significant jump to 100,000. So are there any issues there with repayment of the loans as we currently sit? And maybe I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you. Dana, would you like to answer, or Matthew, whichever you prefer?
Maybe I'll defer to Matthew on this one.
Okay, absolutely. So we haven't had any issues to date, so we're comfortable with that. We felt, and we could put some more specific language around how you could qualify up to 100,000, specifically if you're going to do a full restoration of the outside of the building. So if you're doing, either cladding the building or doing the brick and mortar repairs and things like that, then I think in that case that we would see $100,000 being more appropriate. Mm-hmm. Or if you're completely gutting the inside of the building and bringing that back either to commercial, residential, those types of things. So we also wanted to make sure that it wouldn't. So if they're spending, the only time we would get up to 100,000 if they were spending $400,000 on the project. So that was really what we were looking at from that standpoint. And so I think that we could provide some additional language around when you could exceed $20,000 and what projects would qualify for that.
Any follow-up? That's good, yeah. Okay. Leanne, do you have any questions for Dana? Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. I actually had the same question, one of the same questions as Jim, the increase of the loan category from 20,000 to 100,000. And I think Matthew is excellent about talking about the language that we're going to require in there. And it's got to be easy language, if you know what I mean, like public friendly, that they're going to recognize that, they can't just go in and, oh, I want $100,000, mm-hmm. Right? You got to have that checklist. You got to have that checklist. And speaking of the checklist, I like that we're putting more language into that as well, getting the checklist and going that route. I did have another question as well. It just left me for a second. Hang on. When you bring this to council, it might be a good opportunity to say your little quotes, Dana, because I mean, we're looking at the presentation, but we don't realize that, the sign, the $1,000 for the signage grant is not even covering the cost of signs now, mm-hmm. Right? So I think it's important to definitely put that in black and white, the little helpful hints, because I can tell you right now, and Councillor McConnell's going to read this and he's just going to go, whoa, right? So, I mean, just to prepare yourself a little bit more. And I can guarantee you there will be concerns around
the double dipping for the tenant and property owners, because I do distinctly recall a concern about that not being used for leasehold improvements. And I think that is on us to a certain extent to provide a bit more of an education or rationale behind that, because I see it as the complete opposite. Anyway,
Me
sorry to
too.
cut you off. Please go ahead.
No, and I'm the same way as well. Like if I'm the owner of the building, you know, I'm going to do my own twist. But if you know, a tenant comes in and wants to paint flowers on the wall because she's a florist, well, that's their, you know, they're renting from me, but they want to do their own, put their own spin on it per se. But, and I think that was it for now, but if I think of another question, I'll ask.
Sure, for sure. We have other categories and there's.
Yeah, that's right.
To the different categories, but Dana, I want to comment how issuing the loan payments in installments, just for a whole bunch of reasons, how much that makes sense to me. So I really enjoyed that, reading that. To incorporate, I also really like the grant repayment if a couple of scenarios come into play. How would we do that? Would we have to, could we legally do that on the tax bill?
I believe so. Matthew, can you speak to that?
As long as we put it in the agreement itself, that they sign up to, then I believe that's legal, but we will absolutely go through our legal department just to make sure that we're not violating anything in terms of that. Super. And again, language would have to be quite, you know, not fine print, you know, kind of thing on that. And expanding the area, because that, I believe I was copied maybe on one suggestion. I was trying to find it, but I can't find it. So I know the funeral home at one time expressed interest. So that proposed expansion area would include the funeral home.
No, it would not include the funeral home. This proposed expansion would be focused strictly on King and Edward Street. And it's, you know, those are the arteries, so to speak, that we feel have the most, you know, visibility from a commercial district. And and the CIP program, it's the intent really isn't, as much as I would love to, I think there can be merit sometimes when you look at it from that perspective. The intent of the program, especially when you're looking at those downtown areas, is that it's defined as a special district. You know, there's architectural value, there's heritage value to those properties or to that district that makes it, you know, separate, almost a separate commercial entity, or almost a standalone neighborhood, so to speak. So you could also make the same arguments for the employment area, because that's our industrial core that we've identified as a community that we're trying to focus those employment related developments, the job creation developments in. So it makes sense to provide incentives to support that. So that's really what I would say, you know, the broader intent is. So again, this is obviously, of course, up for debate through the committee. You could certainly look at expanding that to the entire commercial core south of the railroad tracks, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, because I feel like that doesn't necessarily fit with what the true intent of a CIP program is. Just food for thought.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Okay, so, Councilor Burton?
Right, I have another question, if I may.
Sure.
Thank you. I do like the thought of the loan funding as installments instead of the lump sum. Is that's going to be in black and white as well, right? Good language in there for, you know, is that an arrangement that can be obviously on paper with the owner or renter about, like, if it's monthly or bi-weekly or weekly payments, like how are we looking at doing that?
So it's an annual payment. It currently sits at, it's over the period. So it's repaid over 5 years.
Right.
split into 5 equal payments at the $20,000. It's a $4,000 annual repayment. But again, it would be prorated depending on the value of that loan. Matthew, sorry, I just saw you were unmuted.
So they can pay more often if they choose, but at the very minimum, it's a yearly payment of 1/5.
Okay, so there is definitely a clause in there that they have to make that payment, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you.
And then at that point, Matthew, correct me if I'm wrong, if they don't make that payment, then it would automatically go on their taxes.
That is correct.
Good
Great.
stuff.
And then it becomes starting to earn interest at that point.
Oh yeah, that is a good, very good, yeah, point.
Mhm. Great.
And actually, that's another, that brings up another point, Dana, Matthew, is at the council table, no doubt they would say, ask us to measure hypothetically 2 or 3 loans at 100,000. Mind you, it would, as you clarified, Matthew, these have to be big projects, right? Because it then would have to be a $400,000 project, which is far and few between. But anyway, somebody's going to say where the interest that we're not gaining. They're going to ask for some kind of prediction to that, no doubt.
So that's a very great point, and I'll add that to the list. Also, just want to make a point that when we pay the loan funds out currently, it's all done based on they submit invoices, we go through those, does it apply, yes or no, and then we make payments out on that. What we're suggesting is instead of, so if they spent, let's say, the whole $20,000 in the first phase, but they're not done the project, under the current guidelines, we would pay them out pretty much the entire amount with the exception of a holdback. But if we go with it in the building permit, then we would only pay a maximum at each building inspection. And so that way it makes sure that they don't get the whole 20,000 up front, even if they've spent all of that. And it has an impetus for them to continue the project to fruition. So that's really some of the thinking behind that kind of concept. We always do it based on what they've spent so far, but then it's really just saying, let's say when you've done your studding point and haven't closed up the walls yet, but if you've passed your electrical and plumbing and studs, then you might be able to claim up to 25 or 50%. Once you hit your next milestone, then you get the 75%, and then you get the final amount when you can reach occupancy. So it's just kind of taking that slightly different approach to be able to say that you're only going to get funds as you progress, as opposed to as you spend the money.
Matthew, I can understand that logic, and it's similar, I think, to banking construction loans. The same cash flow. Will this make any undue extra work for the men of this program?
I don't think so. We're still going to receive all of their bills and their information. We would just say you're at this point. So, let's say the total loans for 25,000, and we have 4 milestones, or 20,000, we have 4 milestones. Then you're entitled up to $5,000 at this point. When you reach your next milestone, if you've already submitted bills that exceed the $10,000, then you'll automatically get it at the next, as you pass the next milestone. So it's just a matter of kind of not very much different than what we do now. It's just putting a cap on the payment that we pay out at any one particular point.
Okay, very good. Thank you. If everybody's okay, if Dana, if you could move on to the next area, which is the employment area.
Thank you, Chair Jansman. Okay, so you'll find there are some similarities between this area and the downtown. We do have a similar interior commercial grant under the employment area that we're also recommending an increase to. So it would be an increase from 3,000 to 5,000. This is it's still a very nominal grant when you look at the grand scheme of things, because this employment area is really directed to more the industrial, job creation, larger employers in the community. And we've had, haven't had a whole lot of uptake on this category to date, but the ones that have noted that they would certainly like to see an additional increase, and that 5,000 I think would be a more appealing amount to make it worth, applying, or at least expressing interest in that program. And because there are some reporting requirements and ongoing, provision of invoices that need to be provided and back and forth. So it creates administration for the property owner as well. So we certainly want them to see it as being a worthwhile program. And we would also recommend increasing the permit fee, very similar, from 500 to 1,000, or up to a maximum of 10% of the permit cost. So there are some projects, especially in the employment area, that could be upwards of $1 million or $2 million, and would have a fairly high permit fee associated with that. So we certainly want to limit what we can provide, but at the same time, we recognize that $500 or $1,000 is very minimal when it comes to some of these projects and what they are actually having to put out in permit fees. And then we're also proposing under this category to add a new category, a new incentive, which would be a streetscape area grant. So this would provide up to $5,000 for property improvements, including landscaping, pedestrian amenities, ground signage. If you look to properties like Kriska, Next Polymers, they all have it's more of like a gateway area that's, it has treated with some landscaping, some nice perennials, generally a nice ground sign, potentially some lighting, really to try and dress up the property as much as they can, while still recognizing that it is an industrial operation and that is what is taking place there. But we do feel it's important as a municipality to have, these properties put their best foot forward and at least have a welcoming entrance area. And I think that's what this streetscape area would really help to address, because there are some that certainly would be good candidates, I think, for this grant category. And then we're also recommending an increase for the employment area to the loan program. It would be the same terms as we're recommending under the downtown area, which would be increasing it up to a maximum of $100,000, not to exceed 25% of the total project value. And then again, very similar to the previous recommendation, would be issuing loan funds as installments and have them tied to, actual project completion milestones and building permit inspections to ensure that the work is actually being completed as proposed. And also recommending increasing the project completion deadline from 12 to 24 months for the employment area. And again, recommending permitting multiple funding applications for property under the same conditions that we had previously, which would be to support those separate owner and tenant initiated property improvements. There are some properties that have one owner properties that have multiple industrial tenants in them in the employment area. So those would be really good candidates for this new extended ability. And also supporting subsequent renovations completed no less than 36 months that are distinct from the previously funded projects. And then if the industrial tenancy changes, no less than 24 months after funding is received by the previous tenant. So again, to allow that if the tenant does change and wants to make additional leasehold improvements, then they would be eligible to apply to the program once again. And then again, no less than 5 years following the receipt of previous funding in those situations where just time and certainly leads to deterioration and decay, so to speak, and things need to be refreshed and upgraded to ensure that properties are sound and still contribute to the overall aesthetic of the community. And then expanding the eligible area to include all existing and rezoned to industrial properties is another amendment that we're recommending. So this would basically, we have a situation where what's currently defined as the employment area can change as new development comes in. We have still some large parcels of vacant or underutilized properties that could eventually become industrial properties, and we wanted to provide for that opportunity for, as those changes come in, to be able to tap into this program as well. And then we're also recommending a grant repayment requirement under the same conditions as the downtown area if the project isn't completed within 24 months, or if the property should sell as well as change use within 24 months of approval. And I'll stop there, maybe for comments and questions again.
Thank you, Dana. Yes, Councillor Burton? Oh,
All right, Jim had his hand up first. I'll let Jim go.
okay, sorry. Sorry, Jim.
Thanks, Chair. That's no problem. Yeah, I hear where Dana's coming from in terms of the industrial areas. I think she mentioned Next Polymers and Kriska, and those are very visible, and there's quite a bit of traffic on those streets. I think the emphasis needs to be on downtown and other areas in Riverwalk and that, so which is fine. That's, I think, where the most emphasis is. So I would just ask if do we need any guidelines or any goals for specific for this area? That's the only question I would ask. I can, I'll just leave it at that. So now in the downtown, we're going to have maybe better guidelines. And do we need anything? Is it there now, or do we need strengthened guidelines for the employment area, just to make sure we're meeting our goals there too? That's all I have, Chair.
Matthew, would you like to?
I think it's a really great point. And when I think about that, if we were to tie it to employment increase, that any grant or any loan being applied for has to be tied to an increase in employment. And I think the Northern Cables one was a great example where we noted that, you know, our offering $20,000 on a several $1 million project for a loan really wasn't all that attractive to them. And so we tried to think about other ways we could help that. And I think what we heard from a feedback perspective was the permit cost. If there's some way to defray that, that would be important. And then from a staff perspective, kind of on the streetscaping side, you know, going along what we're trying to do from an overall community standpoint, just making it more livable, more enjoyable, and the fact that we're going to have more people going through that area with the addition of the recreation complex there. So that was kind of some of the thinking behind those. But I think if we attach any of those grants or any of those loans to say it has to be offset by an increase in employment, then, you know, I think that really gets to what we're trying to achieve there by providing funds, but ultimately by providing additional employment supporting that.
Yeah, follow up? No, all good, Jim? Perfect, thank you. Leanne?
So I just did want to say, if I could, these points are fantastic. And so I'm just kind of making notes as I go along, but it really helps us to try and fill out, like we brought the broad concepts forward, but you're really helping trying to get down to the nitty gritty of what we need to fill out the rest of it for. So I'm very, very thankful that we're having a very fulsome discussion here, and thank you for that.
Perfect. There's no pressure here now, Leanne.
No, and the best thing about that, Matthew, is you can go back to YouTube and watch it all over again.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Many, many times. It's what I do.
Right, absolutely.
Puts me right to sleep.
Anyways, I wanted to comment on the expand eligible area. I think that, again, going back to council, I think that they're going to require, or we're all going to require, a map of where you're thinking of the eligible area is. And I do like Jim's comment about the goals that he mentioned as well. And I think that was it for me for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Dana, I was going to ask this question maybe perhaps at the end, but I'm fearful that I'm going to forget. With your network with other municipalities, have you already, or is it something you might still entertain contacting them? Like, do they have anything similar that you could have a conversation with to compare notes, so to speak?
So we've done, I've done a lot of research just in bringing forward these recommendations and just over the past several years and looking at what other municipalities are doing and, just ensure that we're on par. But I think it's important. It's an important investment attraction incentive as well. So that's why I think it's important to be looking at things like, for example, the permit, adjusting that from a flat rate to more of a percentage-based incentive, as well as looking at taking that approach with the loan program, because we are seeing a lot of communities that are offering these programs are going more to those percentage-based incentives versus offering, that flat rate, because it does somewhat limit, what can be offered for different properties. But I would say I'm also very pleasantly surprised to see that we are very competitive for a municipality of this size. The incentives that we are offering as it stands to date are very robust. And I would say, when you compare apples to apples based on per capita, we are providing a much broader mix of incentives, and especially under, when you're looking at the new residential incentives that we're looking at providing, we're taking a pretty progressive approach. And I think we're also seeing that, the results of that in the business interest and the development interest that we have in the municipality. As much as we may sit here and think, how much is $5,000 difference going to make at the end of the day? But when you take that in combination with the loans, as well as the tax increment incentive, those are some pretty significant incentives that we're providing. But I would say we're very much on par with what other municipalities are bringing to the table.
Well, thank you. That's awesome, because it is really quite apparent that a lot of thought and research has been put into this. So it doesn't surprise me to hear that comparisons of other programs was done. So that's great. Okay, are we good to move on to, sorry, Leanne?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one more question, if I may. How are we policing the 5-year? Like, if you only have, no less than 5 years following the receipt of previous CIP funding, how are we policing that? How do we know if the 5 years up?
So we have a master spreadsheet essentially that we use for the tracking of that fund. It's a document that lives on the server. So it's something that I inherited when I started. It actually goes back to the previous CIP program as well, back to when CIP ever first came on the horizon. So we can look at that and also see not only what applicants have received funding under the current program to ensure that they aren't being duplicated, but we can also look at the historic grants that have been received. And something else that we have just recently built into the new CGIS system is adding that information as well. So in the new mapping system, we actually have all applications uploaded to that. So as as you're looking at information, any member of staff that has access to that can see what properties have received funding to date, whether it was grants, loans, and that also helps building department and other departments that are working within those properties so that they're well aware of, what type of incentives have been received in the past. And it ensures that, God forbid, staffing changes ever happen, we have that permanent database for whoever should take over that file to go to.
Right. And that was my whole comment about policing it, because, staffing change, like you said, and not that I want anybody to leave right here, anybody, nobody. But I think it's important that people watching this know that we are tracking it, that we do check up on things, and if we do happen to have a staff change, that we still are on top of things. So that's great. Thank you for your response, Dina.
Certainly.
Okay, are you set to go with the heritage area, Dana?
Yes, thank you. So these next two sections will be three will be fairly short and sweet, not as extensive as the first two. So where this brings us to the heritage area, we offer a number of incentives for heritage designated and historically significant properties throughout Prescott. So it applies to the entire community, but it's based on the designation or heritage value of those properties. So we're proposing under this program, we currently don't offer any loan incentives under the Heritage Property Program. And I think, as time continues to go on, we're certainly going to be, we've already encountered a few heritage properties that have gone into a fairly significant restoration. And we've also had some interest from heritage property owners in this program, but just haven't really, proceeded with the uptake because at this point, it is somewhat limited in what it can provide. So we thought the loan incentive would be a really great way to, hopefully encourage some heritage or historically significant property owners to consider some of those more extensive renovations that need to be completed to ensure that those properties remain valuable and vital to the community. And so we thought that would be a good incentive to bring in, not really recommending any changes to the existing grants that we have available. We would recommend for the permit fee grant, a very similar increase from 5,000 to 500 to 1,000 to a maximum of 10% of the permit cost. Again, to hopefully support those broader heritage property restorations that property owners are sure to encounter. And then we would also recommend increasing the project completion deadline from 12 to 24 months, again, because you're probably getting into some big, extensive restorations that will take a longer period, especially when you are dealing with heritage properties, because you get into a requirement to use much more specialized contractors and materials. So those are the big three under heritage.
Awesome. Actually, I for another reason too, with one of the many results of the global pandemic, the delay in supplies, as we have experienced for our projects, would make sense to extend the completion deadline to 24 months as well. So, Jim or Leanne, do you have any questions for Dana in this section? No? Okay, let's move right along then. Dana, please.
Okay, and into the brownfield area. So not a lot of adjustments recommended under this area. I think the program I've seen it utilized once since I've been administering it. And I think the program works. The grants are designed to provide funding for environmental assessment, phase 1 and phase 2. As well as to, it's more the taxation. So there's the tax increment grant that's part of this area, as well as the tax cancellation program, which is available while the property is being rehabilitated, if there is actual environmental cleanup that needs to take place as a result of those studies that have been completed. And then as part of the redevelopment, we're able to offset the tax increases that come through the tax increment program. So it's already a very robust program, which is why we're not really bringing forth a whole lot of recommendations for changes under that, aside from a couple, one of which is to increase the permit fee, again, similar to the other categories, from 500 to 1,000 or up to a maximum of 10% of the permit cost. And then again, to extend the project completion deadline from 12 to 24 months. I would say this is certainly needed in this area. It can take a significant amount of time just to be able to complete those phase 1 and phase 2 studies.
Indeed.
And that's it under that.
Okay. Unless Leanne or Jim have a comment, maybe we can move on to the new residential area.
Yeah, so this is an exciting one. brand new category that we're proposing, and this is geared to residential development, really to provide, hopefully to provide some incentives to encourage more residential development happening throughout the community. I'm sure, as we can all recognize, we are certainly in a housing crisis. It seems to be the term of the day right now, but it's a reality. It really is. And if there's anything that we can do as a municipality to hopefully encourage residential developments, I think this is a great way to do that, because it helps us avoid, we can get around offering incentives through this program that we normally wouldn't be able to, because it would be deemed bonusing. So I think what we're recommending here would be a very similar, the largest benefit that we could really provide through this program would be the tax increment equivalent. So this is to offset the tax increase that comes from those new residential redevelopments. A lot of times we're going from vacant lands to lands with, full-on residential assessments. So we're talking significant tax increases that would be tied to that. And what we're proposing, a little bit different because they would be significant, would be a tax increment grant program that would start on a sliding scale at 50%. And decrease by 10% each year for 5 years. As you'll likely recall, the increment incentive that's available under the other areas is up to 100%. So we would be recommending 50% under this residential category. And then also proposing a permit fee grant of $1,000 or up to a maximum of 10% of the total project value. Again, could be a very significant savings for a large scale residential development. And we would also have a condition attached to receiving funding under this program that the minimum project size would be $5 million. This is by no means meant to be a program for someone who wants to construct a single family home. That's not the intent. The intent is really to encourage those larger scale residential developments. And I will say, we did quite a bit of research in looking, what some other municipalities are offering. It's a real mixed bag, where some are offering things like cash in lieu of parkland, but that's something that's a requirement that we haven't ever really initiated or implemented as a municipality. So we didn't see there really being a need for that. There are a few others that are looking at some other incentives that just really wouldn't be relevant to Prescott. And the reality is, these are also communities that have much larger masses of land that they are trying to incentivize development on. The reality is that we have, we're somewhat limited in what we do have for available land, as much as there are some large vacant portions of land, and there is no lack of interest. We aren't a municipality that's sitting here hoping to gain any interest that we can. Developers are recognizing the value that Prescott brings to the table, and we don't want to give the farm away, so to speak, if the interest and the demand is there for opportunities. So I think this is a good compromise between what municipalities of differing sizes are doing.
Thank you, Dana. Jim or Leanne, any comments for Dana on this new section? Councillor Burton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think you made a really good point there, Dana, and I think it maybe should be added in with the notes that you talked about. We need to add the intent. It's not intended for smaller projects, right? I think you said it perfectly, that this is for bigger projects. And so, we don't want somebody coming in and saying, oh yeah, I want to build a small subdivision and it's only going to cost, I don't know what small subdivisions cost, but on a smaller scale, right? Yeah. It's meant for the bigger scale. And I think that wording, back to the language, as Matthew talked about earlier, needs to be in there somewhere. Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, I think Matthew Matthew, if you want to address Leanne's, and then we go to Jim. You're on mute there, Matthew.
There's another stipulation we can put in is that it's for large scale developments, and there could be a minimum percentage that have to be affordable units. So that way we're killing two birds with one stone. And again, it works towards the intent. And I think if you look in both our new official plan as well as our the Leeds and Grenville official plan, that it talks about aiming for 2% of having affordable units. And so that could really help what we're trying to address here. So we're intending on large scale development, and I think 2% is the number that the United County uses, which I believe we're also looking at adopting. That could be the caveat there, and really that tax incentive helps support that affordable housing initiative from a developer standpoint. So it's just one note I wanted to make. I apologize, Dana, that I didn't mention it before, but it's just something that kind of popped in throughout the day today. So.
No, Matthew, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it was an oversight on my part too. When we were looking at some of those examples that other communities were bringing in, it was always tied to that requirement of having a certain percentage be that affordable housing, that it fits within that threshold of you're spending no more than 20% of your income on housing. So it certainly, I would recommend. Thank you. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that was a huge oversight on my part. Absolutely, we would include that language within that.
Okay, Jim, did you have something?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Dana. In terms of how this is going to work, if we take a typical plan of subdivision, a residential subdivision that has single, semis, maybe some townhomes, how is that tax increment going to be applied? Because I'm sure we don't intend to apply that to a decrease in the taxes when a person buys the property and builds a house, or maybe we do. And I can see how it might apply to like a condominium development or an apartment development that's owned by one owner and one land. So I just did a little clarification on how that tax increment is going to be transferred to the developer or the final purchasers of the product.
Matthew, if you want to take that one.
So what we would do is as each become occupied, and so let's say each one is sold and we start collecting the taxes, we would have an amount that would go back to the developer at 50% in the first year, 40, 30, 20, 10. And that's how it would function. So it's very similar to how they do condo developments, where each owner of the condo pays their own property taxes. It goes back to the developer, and then we're able to split it out that way. So that's how it would be drawn up. And then also it allows for multiple phasing. So if they complete and sell units, that sort of thing, or if it's an apartment building where everyone's renting, then it's as it becomes occupied, then that's how we shift the amount back based on what we collect.
Very interesting. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Chair.
Dana, this whole section is very, very exciting, very new. Perhaps to Jim's point, when presenting to council, to actually provide an example would
Of what that would look like.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
it would potentially decrease the number of questions, you know?
Mhm.
And your comment, like, this is not intended for typical residential homes or residential homes with granny suites or anything like that, because 5 million, as we're starting to learn, isn't a whole lot of money. So it could almost, residential could almost fall into that. So maybe having a minimum number of units in there too. Right? Like if somebody's thinking of a small apartment building of 4 type of thing, it would cost more than 5 million, but yeah, then it's, I'm not saying it very well, but to have it be a minimum number of units or houses or whatever might be an idea to put in there.
Mhm.
And Matthew, to your point about the affordable housing, would 2%, or could we possibly consider, or would it be to our benefit to consider like a certain number of units cannot exceed the market rent, or some kind of wording like that?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few things that that we could go about doing it. Well, we'll take a look at how some or others are structured. We could say 2% of units with the minimum of one. That
Exactly, yes.
provides a, if you're only doing 10%, then, or if you're only doing 10 units, then it would be 0.1 of a unit is
Yeah.
or 0.2 of a unit. So,
Right.
that would allow us then, at that point, if it's a minimum of one, well, 10% is actually what we're looking at. So I think there's a few ways we can structure it. And when we talk about affordable housing, I think we also need to talk about exactly what that would look like in terms of rental versus purchasing. And so I think there's a couple things that we can do there. So we'll kind of further outline that and then provide more wholesome type of points for discussion.
Yeah, perhaps, and I'm just thinking out loud, is it necessary to have almost two sections in this area? Houses, like detached houses, row houses, semis, and then apartment buildings, perhaps.
Yeah, I think you could do it a couple of different ways. One is pure rental versus ownership model. There's a couple of different ways we can split it.
Sure.
And I certainly think that those are all great ideas.
And then with each model, provide an example, So hypothetically, if somebody was, 4 years ago, decided to build an apartment building downtown, and this, of course, didn't exist, did the developer have any kind of course, this is a new section, so they wouldn't have exercised any CIP, but would they have had any kind of permit or tax incentives or anything like that?
Under the brownfield, if it's a brownfield property, yes, but not just a straight up
Okay.
residential.
Wonderful. And I'm asking that on purpose, just in case somebody's watching, because just to understand that this section is a new section, that there was not any kind of that happening beforehand. So this is my application process. This is reviewed and monitored and all that kind of stuff. So thank you for that.
Two things. One we're going to get to just in the next section is that you can't apply for more than one area stream for the same property. So even though your property might be a brownfield and it might be a heritage and it might be in the downtown, you've got to pick one. You can't pick from all three. The other thing is we will have transition rules that says it's this point going forward, not any developments going backwards. So those are two things that help solidify it for people and understand.
Perfect. Thank you. And maybe that's a nice segue for your last slide, Dana.
Thank you, Chair Jansman, through you to the committee. So this takes us to the end. This is more the housekeeping section. So this really just touches on some of those more general items, administrative oversight items that we feel should also be addressed as part of this. And I know that there's been a lot of discussion coming out of tonight that will certainly be adding to this list when we bring the final presentation forward. But I'll just take you through. This is what we've identified initially would be the addition of a definition section. We've talked about this, I believe, in the past, where, there's quite a few terms throughout that program guide that I think requires some clarification, definition. And I think this would also be that good opportunity to build that out with some of that intent language that we've been talking about a lot through this. So I think really addressing that and providing greater clarification and context for potential applicants moving forward. And the clarification that loan funds cannot be used to support the matching grant portion. So this is another area that we've run into, again, just with a bit of, misinterpretation. I think stronger language needs to be built into that program to really clarify that, for example, if you're receiving Facade grant funding, and you've also received loan funding, the loan funding can't be used to offset your expect your portion of that facade funding. For example, if you receive 50% funding, you can't utilize that loan funding to cover your 50% of the cost. That's really not the intent of the program. The loan funding would be, meant to be used for additional work above and beyond what's being covered under that facade grant or the signage grant or the interior commercial grant. The loan program, again, is really intended for those properties or businesses that are engaging in some of those more extensive property restoration, where they're going to be incurring a much more significant expense than what could ever be covered through the grant program. And then on to the next one is clarification that only one area stream can be applied for per property. This is what Matthew just spoke to as part of our previous conversation. So you can't double dip, so to speak. If your property is in the downtown core and it also happens to have heritage designation, it's a one or the other. You either apply under the downtown category or the heritage category. And for the Riverwalk downtown area applications, the property must have a commercial component and not be strictly residential. There is that potential case, just the way the downtown core area is established, that you have some of those properties on side streets or adjacent areas that could potentially be used for residential purposes only. And we certainly want to ensure that that language in there is very strong to identify that that's not the intent of the program. The intent of this program is for properties used for commercial purposes. If they happen to have residential second and third story uses, all the better. But the real intent is for commercial properties. And finally, applicants must submit a plan for the use of funds for loans and grant expenses. To date, we've really focused on, as far as the performance requirements and the plans that have to be submitted, is really tied to the grant. So we really want to bring that loan aspect into play a little bit more and have that tied more to the actual work and approved expenses that is going on versus just being a broader loan that can be used for the restoration. We think it's important that there's just a greater check and balance that's built into those loan funds as we're actually issuing them to the applicant. And that's it under housekeeping items. So that brings us to the end of the recommended amendments at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Councilor Burton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excellent discussion tonight, everyone. I think we're that much closer to doing the amendments. One thing, Dana, just the last comment about the applicants must submit a plan. Should we put a business plan in there that not just a regular plan? Is that what you were hoping? Is that what you mean? Like just a plan or the business plan?
A renovation plan.
A renovation plan. Okay. Okay. Maybe some wording in there and an outline of their intent. So great report. Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne. Jim?
I just want to reiterate what Leanne said. Very good report from staff and excellent discussion. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. And actually, I was thinking, I was going to inquire about the definition of what a plan was. So thank you, Leanne, for bringing that up. Would it be a make work project for us, or would it help us if we provided perhaps a template? Just a thought of what one would consider, unless the wording is clearer.
No, I think to your point, a template is good because it's not just a matter of the list of renovations. As part of that, it's what you're proposing for materials, for colors, for your signs. So all of that would go into what we call that plan. So certainly, my intent was to have essentially it built into the application as a form that would be required to be completed.
Okay.
Yeah,
super.
versus just, please submit an executive summary. It's actually
Yes.
going to be built into this as a part of the application process where they would have to complete that, and it would be included in what actually comes before the Planning Advisory Committee for review or approval. And if, should, God forbid, that information not be ready at the time of application, I would also be recommending that once it is available, we bring that back for final approval. Because that's sometimes what we, we'll have a lot of those cases where, they're still kind of finalizing their plans, or they're struggling to get all of their quotes aligned. So I just want to have that check and balance in there to ensure that, even if their full plan isn't submitted, it needs to be prior to the issuance of any of those funds.
Good stuff. So should we, because there's a definite financial implication as part of your staff report, Dana, if we could just spend a couple of minutes to see if anybody has any questions or concerns, or perhaps we think council might have questions or concerns about what's being proposed. The loans, I think we touched on already. It will provide what Jim made mention of. It is riskier in loans receivable. So that's a consideration. Matthew has already agreed to somehow creating a lost interest revenue prediction to this. But the second part of this, if I may, Dana, read from your report, as part of the 2022 operating budget, a $70,000 contribution was made to the fiscal policy reserve. 30,000 of that was allocated, which leaves 40,000, and it's recommended that this 40,000 of unallocated funds be transferred to the CIP reserve to support the amendments of this report. I think personally, I think the knee-jerk reaction of council will be, yay, it's not coming out of any, like it's coming out of something that we already have. So it's not going to cause havoc to the budget or operating budget. But I would love to hear anybody else's point of view on that. Leanne, please.
Absolutely. I think you're right that I think council will be happy that it's not coming out of anything else but about the
reserve. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. The reserve. Yeah, I think that's important to state that. And I just have one more question, if I may.
Sure.
Could this, this is a lot of information, and should we be looking at creating like a little booklet that people can come in? This is the information. These are the forms. This is who you need to contact if you have any questions or concerns, that they can take this home, do the research through the booklet, and then fill out the forms right then and there. Just a thought.
For application purposes, Councillor Burton?
Absolutely. So if I'm a new owner and I'm looking at the CIP program, I want to know all the ins and outs about it. And if all that information is right there with the application form, it might answer some questions when you're going through the booklet per se, when you're filling out the form. I know, just a thought.
Certainly. So we've actually got, it was something that I developed back in 2018, was essentially a guide, an application guide to support that application process, because the CIP plan itself is a very onerous document. It's very, there's a lot of provisions to go through, and it reads more like an official plan, to be quite frank. So we'd gone ahead and developed something that was a bit more user friendly, easy to interpret, and I would be amending that as part of this process to ensure that we have that very easy to interpret guidance document for applicants, along with the full plan, should anyone decide that they want to read through the entirety of the plan. But we'd certainly develop that easier to digest booklet that you speak of.
Great. I haven't had an opportunity to, buy a building or anything to look at the CIP plan. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
For sure.
As a consideration, Dana, Matthew, would it, under the financial implications, would it be helpful if we remind council that ongoing running balance is reported to the planning committee at each time expenditure is potentially approved? And so once hypothetically come September, we have no more funds, we have no more funds, right? Until the next, it might give people more of a sense of control.
Yeah, so I think great point that I think we need to kind of show, especially council, exactly how we keep track of those funds, but then also remind that we do put $25,000 a year in that came from the vacancy rebate when we removed that several years ago. So right. I think absolutely we can flush out that section a little bit more. And just wanted to kind of explain what our intent is as we move forward, is that we would take all the feedback that we got this evening, flush out the report a little bit more, bring it to council. If council agrees with the intent of where we're going with those types of things, we would, fully flesh it out, and then we have to do it in a public meeting for the public to be able to weigh in on this. There's a period that we have to post it, that sort of thing. And then once we get that feedback, we can come back to both planning advisory and council for final consideration. So it just because you're suggesting it to council at this point doesn't mean that it's fait accompli. It just means that we're taking kind of everything that we have so far, seeing if we're all going along the right path. If we are, then we can start to proceed with the public meeting side of it, and more fulsome adding those changes into the plan itself, so everyone understands what the text looks like.
Perfect. It sounds like a nice process where we can slow things down at any time, still gather more suggestions. The public engagement is always a welcome thing. Okay. Any other comments or concerns about this agenda item of 5.2? It's been a while. Do you want me to read the recommendation again? That was moved and seconded. The recommendation was that the Planning Advisory Committee recommend to council the proposed community improvement plan program amendments as outlined in accordance with section 28 of the Planning Act. And as Matthew nicely mentioned, this is just the next step, and it's certainly not the last step. So with that, all in favor? Perfect. Thank you. And so the next item is new business. Does anyone have any new business they want to discuss this evening? No? And well, then the next item is adjournment. So who would like to move that? Jim would. Seconded by Leanne. All in favor? Thank you very, very much, guys, for your time. It's always an awkward thing, but I like Jim and Leanne mentioned, I enjoyed this meeting very much. So it's a very, very exciting thing to happen, and I'm excited to see council reaction to it. So thank you so much, Dana, for your report. It was awesome.
Great job, everybody. Great discussion tonight.